The much anticipated quality of life update for Darkest Dungeon 2 has dropped, and that means that we have a lot to talk about. So without further ado, we're going to go over the patch notes. I'm going to speak a little bit about some of my reactions and thoughts on the changes that they've made, but overall, at a very high level, looks very promising. I'm very excited to see what is in store. So first of all, if you want to try out the latest changes, they are available in the Coming in Hot beta branch in Steam. You can find that by right-clicking on the game, going into the properties, and then there's a beta section, and you can select from a drop-down Coming in Hot if you're interested. The one warning that they give is that if you go to the new Coming in Hot branch, don't expect your save to work if you try to revert. So you're in once you're in. The first big headlining change, though, is Death Armor tokens. So what they say is that we are testing out a new system to handle enemies' death doors. As we mentioned previously, it will now be token-based rather than percentage, like how it works for heroes. We have made adjustments to all skills, quirks, items that have previously interacted with Death's Door Resist, to now engage meaningfully with the new token-based system. We hope that this change will reduce the RNG elements present in battle and give players more information up front regarding how the battle will progress. So basically what this means is that every time you encounter an enemy that when it is reduced to 0 hit points won't die, you're going to see a number of tokens associated with them. And those tokens are going to indicate how many times you have to hit them when they are at 0 hit points before they die. I think this is a really interesting change because it does give us a lot more agency. It means that we can kind of like predict how long it's going to take for that deacon to die, if they will die to a dot at a particular time. Gives you a bit more stalling capacity as well. So overall, I think this is a great change, and it's going to be very interesting to see how it changes the feel of the game. The next major change that they've made is the ability to swap hero paths at the end. The goal of this change is to allow players to better strategize for the region ahead and create a more dynamic party state across the entire expedition. Changing paths will refund any mastery points spent on that character, allowing you to respec your hero. Choosing hero replacement at the inn, players are now able to pick their own replacement heroes from their available hero pool to help salvage their current expedition. So these are kind of two separate things, but the first piece is that now you'll be able to change your path. It's going to cost some resource. They don't mention what it is, but it's very interesting that it's going to refund all mastery points. One thing that I'm immediately curious about that we'll test out in the next stream is whether you can change your hero path to your existing hero path in order to just get the respec. The thing that I think is interesting here that they don't really talk about is that this change, I think, is much more about reacting to the trinkets that you get. As you will probably know if you play any amount of Darkest Dungeon, you'll occasionally find kind of run-defining trinkets. Like the one that's always burnt into my mind is Icon of Light for the Vestal. If you go rank 4, you're going to get a lot more healing out of your regen. It's overall just an exceptional trinket that also has a nice bit of like stress reduction associated with it. So that's a trinket that you can kind of build around, but oftentimes you can't do that because you've decided to make your Vestal rank 2 and, you know, a variety of other things might be going on. And the Icon of Light requires rank 4. So I think this is really interesting. It allows you to adapt to the resources that you have at your disposal. 2 enthusiastic thumbs up. As a side note, my recommendation was to make this a function at hero shrines. So after you've got everything unlocked, you've done all the story beats, you could still use it there. The second piece of this is that choosing hero replacements at the end. And basically what this means is, actually, I think that's on the next slide. It is. So I'll talk about it here. So that was a little copy and paste issue, but the basic idea here is that if one of your heroes dies, you will now get to pick who backfills them. And this is really fantastic for saving runs, because sometimes you already have a tank and they'd be like, here, have a leper and a man-at-arms. And it can be really hard to handle that. Also, the path from the previous run was locked in, so there was a lot of kind of sloppiness to that. Now you'll be able to change the path, presumably, as well. And then the last big headlining feature, other than the kind of like surprise headlining features, are that factions are back in road battles. So road battles will now include the region's enemies. So if you're in the Shroud, you might get deckhands. If you're in the sprawl, you might get whippers. I think that's good. I think that road fights were feeling a little samey, even with the presence of the implication and pillagers and the collector. So now we're going to move on to the line by line. If you're really looking for just at a high level what's been added, that's the main things, with the exception of some more interesting changes to warlocks and the major overhaul to the third confession boss, the Focus Fault. We'll talk more about that at the end in a spoilery section. In the general category, they said that they fixed an issue in which extra actions were incorrectly being granted when a hero was already on a turn granted by an extra action. I think what this means, if I had to guess, is that Smoldering Hymnal can no longer trigger on a kill in a turn with an extra action. But we're going to have to test that out. If it's not that, I'm not sure exactly what the bug was. The Stygian Flame obviously will no longer affect Deathblow resist of monsters because monsters don't have Deathblow resist. Instead, all enemies with Death Armor, which is the term that they're using to describe those tokens, will have one more of them if you're running the Stygian Flame. After equipping a torch or pet, other pets and torches will be removed from the store. I don't know of any bug that was allowing people to take advantage of the fact that you could buy multiple. My suspicion is that this is just because there's a bunch of garbage at the top of the shop that you don't care about in the first region. And then this was a community suggestion, but you can now choose your skill order. The order in which you lock in abilities is going to be the order that they show up in the hero. I think this is nice. I think that it's probably going to get me into some trouble because of just muscle memory issues, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. As for combat items, unsurprisingly, Deathcap Spores is now going to remove one death armor from the target. One thing that I do not know, and we'll have to play around with to find out, is that if you take an enemy that has one death armor and you remove that death armor with Deathcap Spores, does the enemy immediately die? Or do you have to hit the enemy once more when it has no death armor? I think it's the latter, but there's a little bit of ambiguity. I think once all the death armor is gone, enemies are just like normal enemies, so you can't kill anything with Deathcap Spores, but we'll have to find out. And then in terms of deliverables, Hero Remains will now provide +2 mastery upon delivery. A mastery bonus not available for Hero Remains found in the valley. Okay, so you can't kill all your heroes in the valley to get a bunch of mastery. That's a funny thought that you potentially could do that. But this is a really good thing. It's a nice bit of catch up because when you bring in a new hero, you potentially lost a pretty large investment of mastery that you would have had otherwise. In terms of trinkets, most of these are just changes to add the execution keyword. So in place of Deathblow Resist, now you'll have a certain amount of execution, which removes a certain amount of death tokens. What are they called? Death Armor. There we go. I'll get the nomenclature right. So Covert Cloak now has Execution 1. Staggering Striker now has Execution 1. Dismisses Head now has Execution 1. And Vengeful Kill List now has Execution 1. So basically, regardless of how much Deathblow penetration the item had, they've all been kind of rounded up to 1 removal. In terms of quirk, Slayer of Fill in the Blank will no longer be Deathblow Resist, but will instead be Execution 2, which is pretty high. You'll see as we go through the enemies, Execution 2 is going to cover a lot of enemies. The other question that I have about Execution that we will learn very quickly is if you have Execution 2, does the death armor get removed first and then your hit happens, aka that does kill, unlike Deathcap Spores, or does it work the other way around where your hit happens, it clears them, but the impact of the hit happens first? I'm hoping that it is the latter, and Execution 2 really means if something has two death armor tokens, it dies when you hit it with an Execution 2 ability. Time will tell. Moving on to hero changes. The Bounty Hunter, Mark for Death, is now going to remove all dodge tokens. Finish Him no longer pierces Deathblow, but now has Execution 2. And the Leper had some type of funky bug where Self-Inflicted Vulnerable was getting resisted. I am surprised that this change was made not in concert with other self-inflicted debuffs. So to give you an example, I consider the Leper's Blind to be self-inflicted, but it can still be resisted. So I thought resisting buffs that were granted by, say, quirks or passives or trinkets was a normal part of the game, but this seems to imply that in some cases that's not the case. So interesting nonetheless. The Grave Robber gets a bunch of changes to Glint in the Dark, which, if you've been watching my streams at all lately, Glint in the Dark has had a bit of a come up in my eyes as a stronger ability than I thought it was, and it's getting a bit of a buff here. So now it is going to remove all stealth from a target instead of just one. The increased version is now going to remove all stealth as well. Glint in the Dark no longer pierces Death Blow. Instead, it has Execution 1. And if you are stealthed, it has Execution 3, which is pretty cool. It's the only Execution 3 that I think we see in here, or close to it. As for the Hellion, Bloodlust is getting a buff to 30% increase in damage. It has a cooldown that's being added to it. And now on bleeding targets, the Hellion will have Execution 1 across the board, which is a pretty nice token mitigation type of dynamic. And then Bloodlust Plus is no longer going to have the bleed resist. Little sad to see that last bit go, but I kind of understand, and I think also from a flavor perspective, it makes a fair amount of sense. The Highwayman is just execution all the way across the board. Wicked Slice and Double Tap are both going to be Execution 1 moving forward. Nothing else fancy here. It's just like the upgraded versions, etc., etc. The Occultist is getting some not execution or not entirely execution related changes. So Sacrificial Stab is getting Execution 1, which I think is interesting. But the headlining change here is that Binding Shadows is getting a, I'm just going to say, complete overhaul. So Binding Shadows will no longer generate unchecked power on comboed targets. This is a big nerf to Binding Shadows. Part of the reason that I really liked Binding Shadows when I could make it work is that it was very reliable at potentially generating 2 unchecked power right off the bat. That is going away. Binding Shadows Plus will also no longer generate unchecked power against combo. The launch ranks have changed. So this is where you can use the spell from. Previously, you could use it from ranks 1, 2, and 3. That is being changed to 2, 3, and 4. I think this is an exceptionally good change. The issue that occultists were running into that I think this will largely fix is the problem where you literally have nothing to do. You're sitting in the back rank and you have nothing to do with your occultist because you have Abyssal Artillery, you have Demon Pull, you have the big nuke who's blinding stars, something like that, something stars. Sorry, brain is fried after too much Darkest Dungeon earlier today. But nonetheless, it means that now you're going to have a front rank attack from the back row, which I think is really nice. They are changing it though to be a combo consumer that has a debuff resist associated with it versus comboed targets. This, I think, is actually a pretty major nerf to Binding Shadows. And the reason that I say that is because it is a combo consumer for a debuff that I don't think I care about. Debuff resist is something that I primarily only care about at the very beginning of fights. Like I want to get a blind on a deacon or an exemplar, for instance. Later in the fight, I want to make sure that I'm using my combos as effectively as possible. I want them to be landing on pistol shots and, things that have stun or create a lot of value for me. Binding Shadows in this current form with debuff resist is not one of those things. And so I think that's going to be, I think overall it's a good change for Binding Shadows, but Binding Shadows now has kind of like a new downside because of the combo interaction that was added. And then last but not least, the chance of it generating unchecked power has been increased to 66%. It's still much slower than it used to be. It used to be able to generate 2 unchecked power. Now that is only the domain of Sacrificial Stab, which means that I think rank 3 occultists are going to be very firmly cemented as the fastest generators of unchecked power. But the changes go on. Malediction now lasts 3 rounds instead of 3 turns. That is a big deal for bosses, if nothing else. Like now I could see it being useful in longer fights because, like the librarian would be like, okay, it's been a turn, malediction is gone. Whereas now it's going to last for probably most of the fight. Weakening Curse now applies 2 weak instead of 1, and Weakening Curse Plus has a new dynamic we haven't seen before, which is that it clears all the strength before it adds weak tokens. I think that's pretty smart. Vulnerability Hex now applies 2 vulnerability right out of the gate, and Vulnerability Hex Plus now strips block before applying vulnerability. Another great change. And then last but not least, Rid Reconstitution. Weird Reconstitution. I always do that. Old habits die hard from the original Darkest Dungeon when no one ever said that word is weird. But anyways, Weird Reconstitution can be cast at 50% health rather than all the way down at 33. This is fantastic news because it's so unreliable. You often, with your occultist, need to start healing sooner rather than later, or you're going to be in a bad way. As for monster changes, a lot of these are just going to be death armor, so I'm not going to dwell on them. Carrion Eaters get 1 death armor. The Gander gets 2 death armor. The Brute is going to get 2 death armor, and Wilbur is going to get 3 death armor. As for the Cultists, your Evangelists are getting 1 death armor. The Deacon is going to gain 2 death armor, and Exaltation now grants 1 death armor. So Exaltation, that makes it a lot scarier, to be honest. The Cardinal is the same way. 2 death armor with an additional 1 from Exaltation. Exaltation is what they do when they have 2 worship. They cast Exaltation, which is a big hit that also does a bunch of good stuff for them. And then the Exemplar is also 2 death armor with Pillar of Sacrifice now granting 1 death armor. Now, Pillar of Sacrifice gets used very early in the fight. Generally, the Exemplar does it like towards the beginning of round 2, and it is very hard to avoid because you really have to kill that backliner or that second enemy that's with them very, very quickly, or they're going to cast Pillar of Sacrifice, which means that functionally I'm at least going to be thinking of the Exemplar as a 3 death armor enemy 99% of the time. As for the Fanatics, Masterful Kindred is getting 2 death armor. Her Ladyship is getting 2 death armor. The Pit Fighter is getting 2 death armor. And the Pit Fighter's Accelerant is now going to be a regular initiative action rather than being start of turn. And Accelerant is now a high priority skill to use in round 1 rather than being delayed until round 2. Accelerant being the thing that causes them to generate more and more burn over time. And then last but not least, Accelerant is going to grant a strength and dodge token on use as opposed to just the buff that it previously used. So it's going to be a little harder to blow those guys up super quickly. As for our friends in the Shroud of the Fisherfolk, the Hullkeeper is getting 2 death armor, the Docker is getting 2 death armor, and the Leviathan is getting 2 death armor. As for the Gaunt, the Woodsman is getting 2 death armor. That kind of surprises me. And the Ghoul is getting 1 death armor. On to the Lost Battalion, Bullseye Bill, Bullseye Barrett, whatever you want to call him, is getting 1 death armor. The Fallen Templar is getting 3 death armor. I think that is the highest we've seen on any enemy. The Knight will have the same. And On Guard is now granting an additional death armor, making it incredibly likely that the Fallen Templar is going to have 4 to 5 death armor by the time that you kill it. And each time it survives Death's Door, aka you remove a token, it's going to gain 30% damage and 2 speed. I think, honestly, this makes having execution on the Fallen Templar, like, staggeringly important. As for the Foot Soldiers, they'll have 1 death armor, and then the Knight is going to have 3 death armor, gaining 1 from Unguard. So probably a 4 to 5 death armor also. I think the Fallen Templar takes the cake for scariest new elite mob by a mile. Already, it was pretty scary, and now it's up there. As for the Pillagers, the Antiquarian is getting 2 death armor. Plague Eaters, the Lord gets 2 death armor. The Lord and Lady feeding time regen is higher. Also, the speed buff has been increased, and the Lord and Lady feeding time no longer grants an immediate bonus action. Instead, it grants an additional regular initiative action on the following round. This action is subject to dots, daze, stun, and all of the usual combat effects. So it is a full extra turn that will cause dots to tick, etc. And the Lord and Lady feeding time now grants 1 death armor. So it's going to be a little harder to kill them when they are in concert together. And last but not least, the dinner cart is getting 2 death armor. I think overall the changes to the Lord and Lady are a little spooky. I already found them to be one of the more challenging enemies. They're one of the reasons that I'm not super excited to go to the feeder. Other than the fact that the Harvest Child is kind of like an RNG nightmare. But this is another reason to not be too excited about them. As for the lair bosses, they all get the standard death armor overhaul. Dreaming General gets 3 death armor, Harvest Child and Librarian get 2 death armor, and the Leviathan gets a heap of changes. So first and foremost, I think they are largely retuning things to be less focused on start of round skills. So now a lot more things are happening as initiative actions, which my understanding of initiative actions are basically like they are regular actions that happen the first time that the enemy goes, as opposed to at the very beginning of the round. The Leviathan now receives an additional initiative action during the rounds in which he would cast Breath of the Sea. So Breath of the Sea is still a free thing for the Leviathan to do, but it's going to happen the first time the Leviathan goes. Undertow now occurs as a regular initiative action instead of a start of round skill. This is really nice because it means that you can race the hand and kill the hand before it gets a chance to undertow if you are speedy enough. Leviathan's hand now receives an additional initiative action during rounds where it would use undertow, so same thing, still a free action, but it happens when the hand goes. Blatant burn resist for the Leviathan have been increased by 10%. Bleed and debuff bleed resist has been increased by 10% also, and debuff resist has been decreased by 10%. And then fix an issue where Eye of the Storm could target corpses. Eye of the Storm is the thing that directs the hand where to batter and also where to undertow. Overall, looking at this, I would say that this is a nice set of changes for the Leviathan. Adds a little bit of counterplay that is largely balanced out by the increased dot resist, making it more difficult to land your blights and burns than it previously was. As for miscellaneous changes, we have the Gaunt Surgeon's ability, which is, don't ask me to pronounce it. It now works with the Ghoul. The Grave Robber's hero story had some adjustments, and obviously because this is coming in hot, the localization is not complete. So the last thing we have to talk about is the spoilers. So if you're saving yourself or you haven't seen all of the bosses, this is your time to kind of duck out. I won't be showing screenshots of them or anything like that, but I will be talking in depth about the mechanics, especially of the Act 3 boss, so buyer beware. First, though, we have the First Confession boss. They made some tuning changes. So speed of all monsters has been adjusted to reduce the likelihood of clustered actions. The Latch of Regret is a little bit slower. The Bolt of Lamentation is a little bit faster. The Padlock of Wasting is very slow, and the Shackle of Despair is a bit slower as well. So what they're trying to do is if your hero's speed is clustered around like in the range of like 0 to 8, which is pretty normal, you'll probably be alternating like lock you, lock you, lock you. I think it's a good change. I think that before you ended up with these RNG fests where like 4 locks would go and half your people would be stunned or something like that. So good change. As for the lungs, they're getting 3 death armor. Lucky them. But now the headlining thing, the focus fault. What's the big change? So the big change is a lot of stuff. So first of all, they've updated what scene tokens say in the academics view. We'll see that. We'll run Act 3 the next time we go and play Darkest Dungeon, which will be on Thursday of next week, a week from today when you're seeing this, if you're seeing it when it goes live. So scene tokens now have a max of 3. Scene tokens are fully removed when a hero is in stealth. This is very interesting because it means that the shimmer powder, I think it's called, which gives you stealth, is now a countermeasure to scene tokens, and you don't want to get too many scene tokens, as we'll see. One scene token is removed from a hero when an enemy misses that hero, and one scene token is removed from an enemy landing a killing blow on a cloistered eye. So in the first phase, killing the eyes is going to be removing scene tokens, but only the person who gets the killing blow, I think, is removing the scene token, or it's when the killing blow lands on the eye, the scene token that the eye gave is removed. We're going to have to see which it is. I hope that it is the second one, but this wording is ambiguous. Blind is no longer ignored on certain skills for the eye stalk and the focus fault. I think this is good because they say that misses are now going to be a way to manage scene tokens. That means that that blinds are going to be effective. The runaway is going to be a really nice character to have here. We're going to like smoke bombs. Eye stalk, gaze, glare, and glower now apply debuff resist when a target has 2 scene tokens. So you don't want to be getting to 2 scene tokens, but the cluster eyes now apply 3 scene tokens. Their speed has been reduced, and the bifurcated eye now applies 2 scene tokens, speed also reduced. So what this means is that as you are progressing the eyes from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 before you kill them, they are going to become progressively more dangerous at each increment. So I think what that means is you want to blind and manage the small eyes while focus firing one particular eye, hopefully taking it all the way from existing to not existing in a single turn. That's the way I'm reading this. We're going to have to test it out. Science will be done. As for the focus fault, which is phase 2, that's where the big eye swoops in. It no longer gains an immediate action upon starting phase 2. Thank you. Actions per round is increased to 3. No, thank you. The first turn will always include a behold. We'll talk about what behold is in a second. The apply to attacker when crit combo buff has been removed. Thank goodness. It's no longer going to be stealing your crits and your improved dodges or your improved blocks and things like that from your man-at-arms. Reduced bleed, blight, and burn resist to 40. So you will be landing things on it as frequently as you land things on the new Leviathan. And reduced debuff resist from 30 to 20. So those smoke bombs, big money. Smoke bombs are going to be huge. Shimmer powder is going to be huge. We'll have to see what else fits into the lineup. Now, behold, no longer a free action at round start. No longer has a chance to apply weak tokens. Now applies 2 down from 3 random tokens from vulnerable and daze. I think this is great because it means you're not going to constantly be weak and blind, etc. And now only targets heroes with a scene token or a random hero if there are no tokens present. So if there's no scene tokens, it's going to behold someone, which it doesn't say how many scene tokens it adds, but I assume it adds 1 scene token, and then it is going to make them vulnerable and potentially daze them. Also, just as a side note, now applies 2 down from 3 random tokens from a selection of vulnerable and daze. There are only 2 tokens in that list, and it is applying 2 of them. So I guess randomly means it could do 2 vulnerable or 2 daze. 2 daze is a stun, so we'll need to see how that works out. Next up is suppress. So suppress no longer cares about combo. So previously it only happened when there were 2+ heroes with combo. So now the value of holy water is significantly less. Now it requires targets to have no scene tokens and 3 positive tokens. So stacking a lot of positive tokens is bad. This is like a good example of this is if you use take aim on your highwaymen, they are going to have 3 positive tokens and they are going to be susceptible to suppress. It can still hit multiple heroes as long as they meet the conditions. So it can hit all the heroes that are not seen with lots of positive tokens. No longer guaranteed to use a skill when conditions are met. Has the option. It does more damage now. Previously it was very low. Now it's going to do 6 to 8. Now deals 2 stress and reduces the flame by 10 for every hit that it does. This is super interesting because I don't think we're going to get into a situation where a Shambler is going to just come out if it gets down to 0 torch, but we start to have negative effects on us and their positive effects for the enemy as torch goes down. This is the first time we've seen a boss modifying torch, so I think that's really interesting. Chance to apply stun replaced with daze. That's really good. We're not going to have random stuns coming in. And now has a chance to apply weak tokens. So interesting all around. I think the changes to suppress look really good. And then Limerence, last but not least, is has changed radically. Limerence damage scaling per scene token, in this case, increased from 25% to 100%. Now, when the target has 2 scene tokens, it applies debuff resist for the rest of battle. And now when the target has 3 tokens, it has 100% death blow resistance piercing. So things that cause stealth are going to be really, really important, and things that cause misses, like being evasive or having dodge tokens or having consecration, the defensive consecration. Those things are going to be really valuable, because if you're not keeping your scene tokens down, you're literally going to get one shot in and there's going to be no counterplay. But you're going to see it coming a little bit, I think. And now Limerence applies Daze token to non-scene heroes when possible. I don't understand what this means, because I don't think Limerence should be hitting non-scene heroes at all. But maybe Limerence now hits everybody and it just does a little bit of damage to everybody and then has a huge scale up for people who are seen. Hard to say on that one. But with that, we've covered the patch notes. I think the changes to Focus Fault look really promising. Excited to get into it next time. The Warlock changes, I think, are interesting. Without the balance, the jury is going to be out on how the balance feels when we take a look at that. Very excited for the new death armor and execution mechanics. I think they're much clearer. They're much more interesting. And yeah, also excited potentially to kill the Leviathan sometime soon. See how the fight feels, if it feels a little less like railroady than it did before. But that's going to do it for me. If you liked this video or like videos like this, please toss a like and also consider subscribing. Whenever there are patch notes for any of the games we play, I'll probably cover them. I will cover them. And we're coming up on 2,500 subscribers. So join the bandwagon if you would be so kind. We'll be doing a bit of a channel revamp and overhaul as part of a 2,500 sub milestone. But for now, that's been it for me. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and this has been your Darkest Dungeon 2 Patch Notes. Bye-bye.